Canto 11. Summary. In a brief aside, Dante the poet begins this canto by contrasting his experience in the sphere of the sun with the senseless hustle and bustle of earthly pursuits. Here, with Beatrice, Aquinas, and the other saints in the circle, Dante is unfettered and free to enjoy the blessings of this heavenly perspective. Returning to the moment and following Thomas's identification of his brothers in the wheel, the pilgrim still has questions. Thomas, because he gazes into the eternal light, can perceive Dante's thoughts and is thus able to answer his doubts. There are two phrases that he, Dante, would like clarified, from lines 96 and 114 in the previous canto. Only one of them is addressed here, where one is well fattened unless he strays. The second line, which refers to Solomon, will become clear later on. However, before explaining himself, Thomas gives a beautiful and poetic encomium to Francis of Assisi. Of special importance for Thomas is Francis's wooing of and marriage to Lady Poverty, who had been neglected since she wept with Christ on the cross. He notes Francis's first three followers, Bernard of Quintavalle, Agigus of Assisi, and a priest named Sylvester. He then briefly tells the story of how Francis received verbal sanction from Innocent III for his new religious order and official sanction, a second coronet, from Honorius III. After this, Francis journeyed to Egypt and preached to the Sultan. The Sultan remaining unconvinced of his message, Francis returned to Italy, where his ministry had more success. Thomas briefly mentions the famous and miraculous stigmata that Francis received in imitation of the 5 wounds of Christ, on the hands, feet, and side. After recounting his death, Thomas turns to Dominic, that worthy colleague. But instead of recounting Dominic's life, Thomas identifies and rebukes his own Dominican order, which has been corrupted by greed. The first part of Dante's question is now answered. Thomas was laying stress on the qualification he had given his statement that one is well fattened with Dominic unless he strays. Sadly, many of Thomas's contemporaries seem to have done just that. Canto 11. Sun. O senseless interests of mortal men, so very broken are the arguments which force you to beat your wings in a dive. One ran to law, one to aphorisms, another followed after the priesthood, one sought rule by force or by sophistry. One ran to steal, one to civic business, one grew weary, bound by carnal pleasures, another gave himself to indolence, when I, unfettered by all of these things, with Beatrice in the heavens above, was so very gloriously received. After each one had returned to that point in the ring where he was before, each stood fixed as a candle in a chandelier. And from within that light which had spoken to me previously I heard begin, smiling and making himself more lucid. Even as I am glowing with his rays, so too, gazing in the eternal light, the thoughts from which you reason I perceive. You doubt, and wish that my words once again be explained in plain and open language, on a level with your understanding. Where I had said, where one is well fattened, and when I said, no second ever rose, and here one needs to clearly distinguish. The providence that governs the whole world by that counsel wherein is defeated each creature's gaze before it finds the floor, so that the bride of him who with loud cries and blessed blood espoused himself to her, might make her way toward her beloved groom, sure in herself and more faithful to him, ordained 2 princes for her benefit, on one and other side to be her guides. The one was all seraphic in his zeal, the other by his wisdom was on earth magnificent within cherubic light. Of one I will speak, for in praising one I speak of both, whichever I take up, because their works were toward a single end. Between Tupino and the stream that falls down from that hill the blessed Ubaldo chose, a fertile slope hangs from the mountain heights, from which Perugia feels the cold and heat from Portasole, and Nocera weeps the heavy yoke, with Gualdo from behind. Upon this slope, where breaks its steepness most, a rising sun was born into the world, as sometimes from the Ganges this sun is. However, he who of this place would speak, let him not say ascesi and fall short, but orient, if proper speech he seeks. Not yet was he removed much from his east, when he began to make the earth detect some comfort from his regal influence. For youthful, he rushed into war against his father, and for such a bride, to whom, as with death, none unlocks his pleasure's door. He united himself to her before his spiritual court, his father's presence. He loved her day by day with growing strength. Deprived 1100 years and more of her first husband, she, despised, obscure, was without invitation till he came. It availed her not to hear she was found unafraid with Amyclus, at the sound of one's voice who made all the world afraid. Nor did it avail her to be constant and without fear, while Mary stayed below, and weep along with Christ upon the cross. But lest I should go on too secretly, take now this Francis and his poverty to be the lovers of my scattered words. Through love and wonder and tender glances, their harmony and joyful appearance became a reason for such holy thoughts, so much that the venerable Bernard unsandaled himself first and rushed behind such peace, though to him his rushing seemed slow. O riches unknown, O abundant good! Aegidius, Sylvester unsandaled behind the groom, so pleasing to the bride. Thus did that father and master go forth, with his lady and with that family, who had already tied the humble cord. No cowardice of heart weighed down his brow, for being Pietro Bernadone's son, nor for seeming wondrously derided. But regally to innocent he showed his severe intention, and had from him the first seal to his religious order. And afterwards, when the poor people grew who followed him behind, whose wondrous life were best sung in the glory of heaven, through Honorius the eternal breath encircled with a second coronet the holy will of the head of this fold. And later, with the thirst of the martyr, in the haughty presence of the Sultan, he preached Christ and those who had followed him. Upon finding the people too unripe for conversion, and not to stay in vain, he returned to the fruit of Italy. On rough rocks between Tiber and Arno, from Christ he took the final stigmata that for 2 years he bore upon his limbs. When he, who had ordained him to such good, was pleased to draw him up to the reward he earned by making himself so lowly, he commended his most precious lady to all his brothers, as to rightful heirs, exhorting them to love her faithfully. And from her bosom that resplendent soul desired to go, returning to his realm, and for his body wished no other bier. Think now what he was, that worthy colleague who was to maintain the bark of Peter upon the high sea and toward the right sign. And this one was our patriarch. Therefore, whoever follows him as he commands, you can discern, is burdened with good wares. But his own flock has become so greedy for new grazing, it is not possible that they have not strayed off through wild pastures. And however much his sheep may scatter, remote and wandering further from him, the more they return milkless to the fold. True, there are those who fear the loss and press against the shepherd, but they are so few, a little cloth suffices for their cowls. Now if these words of mine have not been vague, if you have been attentive, listening, if you bring back to mind that which was said, your wish will be contented then, in part, for you will see the plant that is splintered, and see what that refinement can convey, where one is well fattened, unless he strays.